February 12, 1946, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The dining hall went completely quiet. 600 German prisoners of war, just sitting there, frozen, staring at their plates, hot food steaming in front of them. But nobody was eating. Not a single bite. Outside, the Kansas wind was howling across the empty prairie. But inside that hall, the only sound you could hear was the nervous footsteps of American guards who had never, ever seen anything like this before. These weren't men fighting against being locked up. No, these were prisoners fighting against being set free. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt stood up slowly. He'd been a soldier in the Afrika Korps, and for 3 whole years, he'd been picking sugar beets right alongside Kansas farmers. His English? Nearly perfect by now. "We will not eat," he said, his voice echoing through that silent room. "Until you promise us, we won't be sent back to Germany." The American camp commander, Colonel Francis Howard, stood in the doorway. In his hand, a crumpled telegram. Orders from Washington. Simple orders. Send all German prisoners home, right away. Geneva Convention says so. He thought they'd be happy, maybe even celebrating. Instead, he was looking at something nobody in Washington ever imagined possible. Prisoners who would rather starve than go home. This is the story of a rebellion that almost disappeared from history. A protest, not against prison, but against freedom. And it shows us a truth about World War II, that neither the Nazis nor the Allies wanted anyone to know. The American Captivity Paradox. To understand why German soldiers wanted to stay in American prison camps, you need to know what their captivity actually felt like. And trust me, it was nothing like what they expected. When Lieutenant Werner Kritzinger got captured in Tunisia back in May 1943, his commanders had warned him about American cruelty. Nazi propaganda told him, "If the Americans catch you, you'll face torture, starvation, maybe even execution." He and his fellow prisoners were packed into cramped ship holds, sailing across the Atlantic, absolutely convinced they were heading toward their deaths. What he found instead was Camp Hearn, Texas. "I could not believe my eyes," Kritzinger wrote later in a letter, now kept safe in the National Archives. "The American guards handed us Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola! We'd been fighting for years, eating stale black bread when we were lucky. And they gave us this sweet, cold drink, like we were guests, not enemies." By the end of 1945, the United States was holding about 425,000 German POWs, over 700 camps, scattered all across the country. This was the biggest prisoner of war operation in American history. The camps were everywhere. Camp Pine in New York, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Camp Mexia in Texas, Camp Rupert in Idaho. And because of Geneva Convention rules, American farm labor shortages, and honestly, a completely different way of thinking about imprisonment, these camps ran in ways that absolutely shocked the German prisoners. Here's what they got every day: 4,000 calories. That's more than American civilians were getting, and nearly double what German civilians back home were surviving on by 1944. In their bombed-out cities, the prisoners earned 80 cents a day in camp money for their work. They had libraries, sports equipment, musical instruments. Many camps had their own newspapers, theaters, orchestras. At Camp Como in Mississippi, German POWs published a newspaper called Der Ruf. The Call. It had book reviews, poetry, deep philosophical debates. At Camp Mexia in Texas, prisoners built this amazing miniature German village, complete with a working fountain. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, they formed a 50-piece symphony orchestra. They performed Beethoven and Mozart. For local townspeople, Gefreiter Otto Weiner was captured in Normandy in August 1944. He'd lost 40 pounds during the brutal fighting in France. Within just 4 months at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, he'd gained it all back. "But I felt so guilty eating that much," he remembered in a 1983 interview. "My mother's letters. She told me she was surviving on turnips and potato peels. And here I was, eating roast beef and ice cream. But the food. That was only part of what changed them. What really transformed these prisoners was meeting regular Americans. The Geneva Convention said POWs could work, as long as it wasn't for the war effort, and with American men fighting overseas, and farms desperately needing workers, the U.S. government started letting prisoners work outside the camps. This is where everything really changed. Every morning at Camp Concordia in Kansas, trucks would pull up to take prisoners to local farms. These weren't just work assignments anymore, they became cultural exchanges that nobody on either side saw coming. German POWs ate lunch at farmers' kitchen tables. They learned English from farmers' kids. They celebrated Thanksgiving, Christmas, with American families. They fell in love with American girls, even though that was completely forbidden. Martha Muller, a German-American farm wife in Kansas, remembered it this way. "We had 3 German boys working our wheat harvest in 1944. My husband was overseas, fighting, and here I was, feeding German soldiers at my kitchen table. But they weren't the monsters from the newsreels. They were just homesick boys, showing me pictures of their mothers, asking if my husband was safe." The transformation went both ways. American farmers who started the war wanting revenge found themselves seeing Germans as real people, individual human beings, and German soldiers, raised on propaganda about American weakness and corruption, discovered a nation of incredible abundance and casual, everyday kindness. By mid-1945, over 200,000 German POWs were working outside the camps, harvesting cotton in Texas, picking fruit in California, cutting timber in Minnesota, processing sugar beets in Colorado. They earned money, sent letters home describing what they saw, and slowly, they began imagining futures that didn't involve returning to a destroyed Germany. Obergefreiter Erich Seibold, a Luftwaffe officer held at Camp McCain in Mississippi, wrote in his diary on June 15, 1945, "Today I learned. The war in Europe has ended. I expected to feel joy. Instead, I feel dread. What happens to us now? Do we go back to the wasteland Germany has become? My city, Dresden, no longer exists. My parents are dead. What is there to return to?" This was the question haunting thousands of German POWs as 1945 came to an end. And it was a question the U.S. government wasn't prepared to answer, the way these prisoners hoped. January 4, 1946, the War Department issued General Order No. 12. All German POWs must be sent home immediately. Geneva Convention requirements. Non-negotiable. The goal: everyone back in Germany by July 1946. The announcement traveled through the camp system, like an electric shock. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, the compound commandant, Oberleutnant Klaus Mittenorf, noticed the change right away. "The men became quiet," he reported to American authorities. "No more singing in the evenings. Many stopped eating properly. Several asked to speak with the camp chaplain, which they'd never done before." The numbers painted a brutal picture of what awaited them. By early 1946, 20% of Berlin was just rubble. In Hamburg, half of all housing was destroyed. Cologne's population had crashed from 750,000 down to $40,000. The daily food ration in the British zone, 1,000 to 40 calories. Starvation levels. The Soviet zone? Even worse. But what scared them most was the uncertainty. Germany had been carved into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Prisoners had zero control over which zone they'd be sent to, and the stories about Soviet treatment of German prisoners. Terrifying. Of about 3 million German POWs captured by the Soviets, an estimated 1 million died in captivity. Even prisoners from Western Germany faced terrible prospects. No housing, barely any food, basically no economy. Many knew their families were dead, or scattered, or missing. Some learned their hometowns were now behind Soviet lines, meaning return was impossible. And then, there was something deeper, something harder to put into words. They had changed after years in America. They no longer fit into the Germany they'd left behind. And honestly, that Germany didn't even exist anymore. On January 18, 1946, at Camp Concordia in Kansas, a group of prisoners wrote a petition, carefully written in English, addressed to President Harry Truman. The document, now preserved in the National Archives, reads, "We, the undersigned, respectfully request permission to remain in the United States of America. We have worked honestly for American farmers who will speak for our character. We have learned to respect American democracy and wish to become citizens. Germany is destroyed and holds nothing for us. We would rather remain as prisoners if necessary than return to certain starvation and possibly death." 47 men signed it. Similar petitions appeared at camps everywhere. 412 prisoners at Camp Hearn in Texas, 289 at Camp Trinidad in Colorado, over 500 at Camp Clark in Missouri. The answer from Washington, clear and final: no. The Geneva Convention requires repatriation, no exceptions. That's when the resistance began. The first hunger strike started at Camp Concordia on February 12, 1946. The scene we opened with within a week. Similar strikes spread to camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. The American camp commanders were completely baffled. Colonel Francis Howard at Concordia had dealt with plenty of problems before. Fights between Nazi loyalists and anti-Nazi prisoners, minor work refusals, even escape attempts. But this was different. This was organized, non-violent, and emotionally incredibly complex. "How do I discipline men for not wanting to leave prison?" he wrote in a report to the War Department dated February 18th. "These aren't violent men. They're not destroying anything. They're simply refusing to cooperate with their own liberation." The strikes weren't the only resistance. At Camp Dermot in Arkansas, prisoners staged coordinated work slowdowns, doing at half speed what they used to do efficiently. Local farmers who'd hired them complained to the camp administration. "These boys have worked hard for us for 2 years, one farmer wrote to his congressman. "Now you're sending them back to starvation. Where's the humanity in that?" At Camp Como in Mississippi, a group of prisoners actually hired a local lawyer, using their saved-up work wages, to explore legal options for staying. The lawyer, a young attorney named Robert Hutchinson, took the case seriously. He researched immigration law, wrote to the State Department. His February 1946 brief argued that German POWs who'd done essential civilian work should be eligible for special immigration status. The State Department's response was swift and negative. Granting such requests would violate international law, undermine the Geneva Convention, create impossible precedents. An official wrote back on March 3rd, "The petitions must be denied. Repatriation must proceed." But the prisoners got more creative and more desperate. At Camp Hearn in Texas, Unteroffizier Josef Kramer had fallen in love with a German-American woman named Anna Schneider. Her family owned a dairy farm where he'd worked for 18 months. Fraternization was forbidden. But in the relative freedom of work assignments, relationships happened. Kramer proposed marriage, hoping it might give him legal grounds to stay. Anna Schneider applied for permission to marry Kramer. The army denied it. Immigration authorities made it crystal clear. Even if they married, Kramer would still be deported, and Anna, as an American citizen, would have to choose between her country and her husband. On March 15, 1946, Kramer attempted suicide, cut his wrists. He survived, but the incident sent shockwaves through the entire camp system. Military intelligence started monitoring for similar incidents. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, prisoners stopped singing German songs in the evenings, a tradition that had been part of camp life for years. Instead, they sang American songs they'd learned, Home on the Range, You Are My Sunshine, even the Star-Spangled Banner. It was a quiet, heartbreaking form of protest, a way of saying, this is who we've become. The American Guards, many who'd formed real friendships with prisoners over years together, struggled with their orders. Private First Class James Morrison, a guard at Camp Trinidad, wrote in a letter home dated March 22nd, "We're packing up boys who've worked beside us, eaten with us, played baseball with us. Some are crying, others just look dead inside. I joined up to fight Germans, and I did, but these don't feel like the enemy anymore." Behind the statistics and strikes were individual human stories, heartbreaking in their complexity. Werner Lenz was captured at Salerno, Italy in September 1943. He spent nearly 3 years at Camp Swift in Texas, working as a carpenter. When he learned his hometown of Dresden had been destroyed in the February 1945 firebombing, he got confirmation that his entire family was dead. Parents, sister, fiancé. What was he returning to? Lenz wrote a letter to the camp chaplain, Father William O'Connor, now preserved in the Catholic Diocese of Austin archives. Dated April 3, 1946. Father, I believe in God's plan, but I cannot understand it. I survived the war, only to be sent back to a graveyard. Everyone I loved is dead. The city I knew is ash. Here in Texas, I have friends. I have purpose. The family I work for treats me like a son. Why must I leave life? To return to death? Father O'Connor tried to intervene with military authorities on Lenz's behalf. He was told politely, but firmly, that exceptions were impossible. Then there was Helmut Friedrich, a former teacher from Hamburg, captured in France in 1944. At Camp Mexia in Texas, Friedrich taught English classes to other prisoners and German classes to interested American guards. He developed a friendship with the camp's education officer, Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, bonded over their shared love of literature. When repatriation orders came, Bradley wrote a formal letter of recommendation for Friedrich, testifying to his anti-Nazi beliefs, his potential value as an American citizen. This man represents the best of what Germany could become. He believes in democracy, has completely rejected Nazi ideology, would be an asset to our nation. The letter was filed and forgotten. Friedrich was shipped back to Germany in May 1946 at Camp Clark in Missouri. A prisoner named Carl Becker had grown close to a local farming family named Wilson. The Wilson's son had been killed at Normandy. Initially, they'd been hostile to the German prisoners, but over time, working alongside Becker, they found something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a more complex understanding. When Becker was scheduled for deportation, Mr. Wilson drove to the camp, asked to see the commander. "I know this is unusual," he said, according to a report filed by the camp adjutant on April 10th. "My boy died fighting Germans, but Carl isn't who killed him. Can't we see the difference? Carl wants to stay. We want him to stay. He could work our farm. Why isn't that possible?" The commander had no answer that satisfied anyone. Despite the protests, the petitions, the pleas, repatriation moved forward on schedule. The process was systematic, impersonal. Prisoners loaded onto trains, transported to ports, placed on liberty ships bound for Europe, most delivered to ports in France and England, then transferred to camps in occupied Germany, to await processing and final release. At Camp Concordia, the hunger strike ended, not because prisoners changed their minds, but because camp authorities threatened to force-feed strikers, punish them with solitary confinement before deportation. Faced with spending their final days in America in isolation, Most chose to eat, spend their remaining time with friends. The final transports left American camps between April and July 1946 at Camp Hearn. Local townspeople actually came to the fence to say goodbye. Unprecedented. Some brought gifts, food for the journey, addresses where letters could be sent, photographs. German prisoners lined up for roll call one last time, collected their few possessions, marched to waiting trucks under armed guard. Many wept openly. On May 23, 1946, the last group of prisoners left Camp Concordia. Hans Schmidt, the man who'd stood to announce the hunger strike 4 months earlier, was among them. As the truck pulled away, he looked back, at the camp, at the Kansas prairie, at the country that had been his home longer than anywhere since the war began. An American guard who witnessed the departure later recalled, "They looked like men going to execution, not men going home." The fate of the repatriated prisoners varied dramatically. Those sent to the American, British, or French zones faced severe hardship, but generally survived. They returned to cities of rubble, an economy in collapse, a population traumatized and divided. Finding housing was nearly impossible. Food remained scarce until the Marshall Plan began delivering aid in 1948 for those whose homes were now in the Soviet zone. The situation was far worse. Many were immediately rearrested, sent to Soviet labor camps. Others disappeared into a police state, where their time in America made them suspects. A few prisoners did eventually make it back to America, though it took years. Werner Lentz, the carpenter from Dresden, immigrated to the United States in 1952 under the Displaced Persons Act. He settled in Texas, not far from Camp Swift, where he'd been imprisoned. He worked as a carpenter until his death in 1989. Helmuth Friedrich, the teacher, also eventually immigrated, arriving in 1954. He taught German at a high school in Missouri, wrote a memoir in 1976 titled Prisoner of Peace, describing his conflicted experience as a German POW in America. Carl Becker managed to return in 1953, sponsored by the Wilson family in Missouri. He worked their farm for 20 years, never married, was buried in the Wilson family plot when he died in 1973. But these were the exceptions. Most never returned. They rebuilt lives in Germany, carried memories of America like ghosts, rarely spoke about their time as prisoners, who had fought to stay imprisoned. Joseph Kramer, who attempted suicide rather than leave Anna Schneider, survived and was deported. Anna waited 3 years, then traveled to Germany to find him in 1949. They married in Munich. She stayed in Germany with him, giving up her American citizenship, the reverse of what they'd hoped. Why has this story been so thoroughly forgotten? Partly because it complicated the narrative both sides wanted to tell. For America, the story of German POWs who loved captivity raised uncomfortable questions. Why did prisoners live better than many American civilians, especially Black Americans, still subject to Jim Crow laws? Several camps where Germans were held had better facilities than African American neighborhoods nearby, a fact that didn't escape notice. For Germany, the story was even more uncomfortable. It suggested some German soldiers had preferred America to the fatherland, which challenged post-war narratives of universal German suffering and victimhood. But perhaps most significantly, it was forgotten because it humanized the enemy in ways that didn't fit clean categories. These weren't concentration camp guards, not SS fanatics. They were ordinary soldiers who discovered in captivity that the enemy they'd been taught to hate was more humane than the regime they'd served. The military files on POW resistance to repatriation were classified for decades. When finally opened, they revealed the scale of the protests. At least 15,000 German POWs across more than 30 camps had participated in some form of resistance: hunger strikes, petitions, work stoppages, legal appeals. None of it changed the outcome. By August 1946, fewer than 5,000 German POWs remained in the United States, mostly those too sick to travel, or those facing war crimes investigations. By 1947, the camps were empty. The last documented letter from a German POW protesting repatriation is dated June 30, 1946, from Camp Shanks in New York, a staging area for deportation. The prisoner's name was Heinrich Müller. He wrote to the camp commander, "I do not ask to avoid punishment for my country's crimes. I ask only to be allowed to stay and build something better than what we destroyed. Is that not justice too?" No response is recorded in his file. He was shipped to Germany on July 5, 1946. The story of German POWs who fought to stay in America reveals something profound about the nature of ideology, identity, and human connection. These men had been raised in a totalitarian state, indoctrinated with propaganda about racial superiority and the degeneracy of democracy. They had fought for Hitler's vision of Europe, and yet, when confronted with the reality of American life, not perfect, not without its own deep injustices, but fundamentally different from what they'd been told, many of them changed. They changed not through punishment or re-education programs, but through ordinary human contact, through eating at farmhouse tables, through working alongside people they'd been taught to despise, through discovering that the enemy wasn't monstrous, just human. And when given the choice between returning to a familiar ideology in ruins or embracing a new future in a foreign land, thousands chose the latter. They chose it knowing they might never see their families again. They chose it knowing they'd be marked as traitors by some. They chose it through the desperate logic of people who had seen both sides and understood the difference. The rebellion failed, of course. The Geneva Convention was clear. International law demanded repatriation. The United States could not simply absorb hundreds of thousands of former enemy soldiers, no matter how reformed they appeared. But the fact that it happened at all, that German soldiers would hunger strike to stay in prison camps, that American farmers would plead for prisoners to remain, that the lines between captor and captive could blur so completely, tells us something essential about the human capacity for change and connection, even in the midst of history's darkest chapter. In February 1946, in a Kansas mess hall, 600 men refused to eat because they wanted to stay in prison. It was a rebellion that made no sense by the logic of war, but by the logic of human transformation. It made perfect sense. They had come to America as enemies and found something they hadn't expected, a future. Being forced to give it up felt not like liberation, but like a second capture. This time, a capture by fate, by law, by the implacable demands of history. And so they resisted, knowing it was futile, because the alternative was accepting that what they'd discovered about America, about themselves, about the possibility of becoming something different than what they'd been, meant nothing in the face of international treaties and political necessity. They lost their rebellion. But the fact that they fought it remains a hidden chapter of World War II that deserves to be remembered, not as a curiosity, but as a testament to the human capacity for change and the tragedy of circumstances that prevent that change from being fully realized. The camps are gone now. Most have been completely erased, returned to farmland, converted to other uses, or simply abandoned to decay. But in the archives, the letters remain, the petitions, the reports of hunger strikes and desperate pleas. And somewhere in those documents is a truth that neither side wanted to acknowledge, that even in war, people are capable of becoming more than their circumstances would suggest. Sometimes even prisoners can be transformed. Sometimes even enemies can become neighbors. Sometimes the hardest prison to escape is the one waiting at home.